Okay, Barbara, we are live.
Thank you, Patrick. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Alma Katsu, our delightful author with us this evening, was originally scheduled to be live at the Poison Pen, but has been felled by a sinus infection. So thank God we have Zoom, because in the old days, before Zoom and COVID, that would have meant cancellation and nothing good would happen. But as it is, as long as Alma can sit up in her chair and talk, we can still do this event. So our autographed copies of her wonderful book, The Fervor, which has this great cover, love the colors, instead has been shipped to Alma back in the East Coast, and it'll take a little while to travel there, travel back. So thank you for your orders. And if you're interested in a signed copy, just be patient and they will magically appear. Anyway, Alma, this is an extremely interesting book, which I can't quite think of a great tagline for it. I think it appeals to several genres: the horror genre, the thriller genre, the historical fiction drama, probably more. So I'm going to let you describe this in a polished pitch, because I'm probably going to flunk.
No, it really is a little different book, even though it's a lot like the two historical horror novels that I did earlier. It's also different in a way. It's kind of allegorical too. So it's got that running through it. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the book and give people a little taste of what it's about. But then I'd like to talk about the history, because I have found, with the previous two books, The Hunger and the Deep, that people really get very interested in the history behind it. So, and I think the history in this case is particularly interesting. So generally, I start with this. People being locked up in detention camps, children separated from parents, white nationalist groups spreading fake news about minorities and taking to arms. Anger against the other is spreading like a disease, seemingly through the air. What year do you think I've just described? Usually this is where people start laughing, because it sounds like 2021, doesn't it? Well, the year is 1944. And that is, in a nutshell, why I write these types of books. I'm often asked, why write historical horror? Why write about something that happened 100, 80, 100 years ago? It becomes more and more obvious with each book I write that history does, the old adage is true. History is going to repeat itself if we don't learn the lessons that it tries to teach us. So I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about the book. Like all the historical horror novels, it's told from multiple points of view. In this case, there are four point of view characters. And it opens in World War II, kind of during the waning days of the war. One of the characters is Archie Mitchell. Archie is a pastor. He's just taken over a congregation in Bly, Oregon. And he decides one day to go on a picnic with his pregnant wife and 5 of the children from the Sunday school at his congregation. And they go off to Gearheart Mountain for a day of fishing. And he drops his wife and the children off and goes to park the car and is getting the picnic things out of the car when there's a terrible explosion. And he looks over, and his wife and the 5 children have all been killed. And I'll just interrupt to say this is a true incident. This was the only death on the US mainland attributed to World War II. The next part I'm going to say is not true, but Archie, the character, is just knocked backwards, can't hear from the explosion. And he can't be sure, but he thinks that in the last moment before the explosion, he thought he saw a woman in a kimono standing on the side of the road, kind of beckoning to him. But he knows that can't be true, because all the Japanese were taken away to the internment camps a few years earlier. One of the other characters is Mako Briggs, arguably maybe the main character. She is the Japanese wife of a US pilot. She was sent to America from Japan to marry a Japanese man in America who was starting his own business. At that time, Japanese men outnumbered Japanese women on the West Coast 30-1. But instead, she ends up falling in love with a friend of this man who happens to be white. Jamie Briggs is his name. He's a crop duster. Well, when Pearl Harbor happens, like many Americans, Jamie enlists, and he's sent off to be a pilot in the war. But that doesn't prevent his wife, Mako, and his child, Aiko, from being taken away to one of the internment camps, and they're brought to Minidoka. So that's where Mako is when the book opens. She's in the camp, and there's this disease, this strange disease that's starting to make its way through the camp. It kind of starts out like a cold or a flu, and I know, doesn't that sound familiar? But soon the people who become infected also display this aggression and hostility, and they start attacking each other. And it's a very frightening situation. No one knows what's going on or what's causing the disease, but Mako starts to be kind of concerned that not only are the authorities not seeming to do anything to help, but she starts to suspect that maybe they actually have something to do with the disease. The third character is Fran Gerstwald, and she's a reporter with a daily newspaper in Lincoln, Nebraska. And right around the same time, she happens to be on a little vacation out in a little cabin out in, I think it's Wyoming, when she sees an explosion, like a fireball in the sky, just like what happened at Gearheart Mountain. And she follows it through the woods, and she sees this flaming debris on the ground. And she knows something, it's her newspaper writer's instinct. She knows there's something strange going on. And it kind of reminds her about some stories she's heard elsewhere on the West Coast of mysterious objects that have caused like downed power lines and that sort of thing. So she wants to track it down, but her editor doesn't want her to do it. They've been kind of turned off by the military that they shouldn't be reporting on these things, that there's an embargo on this kind of news. But Fran really wants to write the story, not the least of which because, she's the female reporter at the time when it was really hard for reporters to kind of make their way, for women reporters, to make their way out of the pink collar ghetto, the women's pages of the newspaper. She wants to break into the front page section. She wants to write serious stories that are important. So she decides to defy her editor and to pursue the story. She ends up getting fired, but she hits the road and is chasing down every lead she can, even when the FBI and the army seem to be they're on her tail and they seem to be trying to stop her. And then the fourth character is Aiko, and that is Mako and Jamie's daughter. And she's a really bright kid, really, really good with languages, picks them up really fast, very smart, very artistic, has a fondness for the folk tales, the Japanese folk tales that her mother told her, and that were told to her by her father too. As a matter of fact, Mako keeps saying how much Aiko reminds her of her father, who was a famous scientist in Japan. Well, eventually, Aiko was told that her mother is taken sick in the camp, and then she's told that her mother has died. And Aiko's not sure she believes this, but she's decided she's going to break out of the camp and make her way back to Seattle, which is the last place where the family was living when her father went off to join the war, because that's where she thinks her father will go to look for her. And so she undertakes this very dangerous solo journey, all the way back to Seattle, where she believes her father is going to be waiting for her. So those are the four characters, and they're all searching for something. They're searching for different things. In Archie's case, he's searching for forgiveness for his wife's death because he blames himself for not being with her when there was the explosion. There's a daughter, escaping from the internment camp, looking to be back in her family. There's a reporter looking for a better job and a better life. There's a mother who's just trying to protect her daughter. But really, they're also all looking for the same thing, and that is the truth. They're looking for the truth of what's happening in the camps and what might be behind it. They want to find out what is the fervor and who's responsible for it. And there's one more thing. All these stories are tied together by a common thread, and that's a forgotten episode in Mako's past, which was a trip she took with that famous scientist father of hers to a remote island off the northern coast of Japan, an island that is reportedly has a link to the Japanese underworld. So that's the story. I'm leaving it deliberately a little vague because there's a lot to discover in it. But I did want to talk a little bit about the history, because as I said, I've kind of learned that it's the history that draws the people to these books. And it's a really important history. none the least of which is because we're losing the people who lived through it. It was about 80 years ago. And a lot of the folks, especially the adults who lived in the camp, they're passing away. And so, it's a much more complex and nuanced story than most of us learn in school. And with the people who experience, that we're losing them, there's a chance we're going to lose that story too. So I kind of felt like it was really important to try to capture this in a novel. Now, unlike the previous books that I've written, the historical horror novels, this one I already knew a lot about when I undertook the book. With the Hunger and the Donner Party, I knew something about it, but I really didn't know the deep story. And the Titanic, I am not a Titanic nerd. So I knew a little bit, like most people, but in both cases, there was just an avalanche of research that I had to do and a lot of facts I had to marshal. So this was very different because I went into it knowing a lot about it. And why did I know a lot about it? Well, because it's part of my family's history. Now, I am not, I'm half Japanese. My mother is Japanese. She came from Japan and she lived in Japan during the war. She was a teenager. So it wasn't my direct knowledge, but oddly enough, I happened to marry also a half Japanese person, and his family had all been interned. They lived on the West Coast. They lived in the Berkeley area of California. They were all sent to Topaz. So for over 30 years, my husband and I have been together a long time. When we started out, I heard about this, and it was my opportunity to learn about the internment. The interesting thing, though, is a lot of the people who went through it really don't like to talk about it. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a bit. So while we learned some things from them, we were a little frustrated because we knew there was more to the story. And so my husband and I both watched a lot of documentaries and reread a lot of books. And I happened to meet other people who also either had family who were interned or, and I'll get to this too, actually, I worked with a few people who had been in the camps as well. And that's when I knew, that this is an interesting story. It's an important civics lesson for Americans. And there's a lot there that if I ever got the chance to write about, I'd want to bring up. So let's talk some basics first, like the internment camps. We've all heard of them. Where were they located? So there were 10 of them. Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Minidoka in Idaho. That's the one that's featured in the story. Tule Lake, which was in Northern California. Manzanar, which they always say was the LA one, but actually it was east of Fresno. Topaz in Utah. In Colorado, there's a camp named Amachi. It was also known as Granada. There were 2 in Arizona, in Poston and Gila River, and 2 in Arkansas, Aurora and Jerome. However, sometimes you'll talk to people, I talk to people, and they'll mention, oh, well, there was a camp near my, where I grew up, and they'll name a place that wasn't one of the camps. And that's because there actually was a whole network of facilities. In addition to those 10 camps, which were the main camps, there were also other camps for the individuals that they deemed too dangerous or, that they were keeping a special eye on. There were transit camps, there were relocation camps, there's all kinds of camps. So I just want to let you know that in case, somebody mentions a camp that's not one of those 10, I'm sure it's an authentic camp. It was just a different type of facility.
Right. Alma, let me ask you something.
Sure.
Strangely enough, if I recall right, there were no camps in Hawaii where there was a really significant Japanese population.
Absolutely. There was no internment in Japan, which, and when we get to talking about the reasons for it, it might make you scratch your head a little bit too. But part of the reason was the Japanese population there was so great, they outnumbered the white population. It just wasn't something that they could pull off.
Right. Now, I can imagine that it's impractical. But I'm sure you'll get to it. I think you have to emphasize that so many of the Japanese who were interned were actually Japanese American. They were really citizens,
right?
They were not foreigners, and there was no attempt in the hysteria that enveloped us after Pearl Harbor. There was no real attempt to sort out the Japanese Americans from Japanese who were not native born. And this also happened to German people. There was some maybe not in camps, but there were some real problems for Germans living, especially in Wisconsin and I think Missouri.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the background on that and I probably should, because it does come up from time to time when I talk, but there's, some additional points that I'm going to make about the circumstances surrounding the Japanese people of Japanese heritage in America. Now, what you said is absolutely true. There was about 120,000 people of Japanese descent who were interned in the United States. 70,000 of them were US citizens.
Right.
70,000. And I do think that that's something that a lot of people don't really grasp. That would be like, the government just taking anybody, US citizen, from their house and telling them, you are going into this camp for undisclosed, length of time. You have to forfeit all your possessions, too bad. And I'll get into that in a minute too. So what I wanted to talk about were the reasons behind why FDR signed the executive order that put the Japanese in the camps. And the reason that you get in school, the popular reason is, yes, because of Pearl Harbor. There was Pearl Harbor and Americans didn't, trust the Japanese anymore. And there was this belief that the US was at risk for Japanese being saboteurs or spies. And this belief that Japanese and Chinese too, but here we're talking about the Japanese, even those born in the US were more loyal to Japan than the country of their own birth. But here's the thing, they knew this wasn't true. Prior to Pearl Harbor, the government, including FDR's own office, conducted studies because they knew that the US was being pressured to join the war. This was coming, right? They had seen this coming. And every government will do this. I'm telling you, I worked at RAND. This is exactly the kind of study we would work on, right? Is there a basis? Do we have any really reason to believe that the Japanese, that there's a threat from the Japanese? And every study conducted concluded that this was not the case. So they knew this. Then why did FDR sign the executive order? Well, that's because there was tremendous political pressure in the United States. From the population who had this belief about the Japanese, from certain congressmen who were pandering to their constituents by really playing it up. So why was there this political pressure? Why was there this public sentiment that was so anti-Japanese? Well, after looking at the facts and the history, you have to conclude that it's due to the decades of racism that went on in this country on the West Coast against Asians in this country. I was shocked when I was doing the research and how many white nationalists and nativist groups were operating openly in the West Coast, and the Midwest for decades, really since the Chinese were brought in to work on the railroads to keep Chinese and Japanese from getting citizenship or from owning land in this country. Now, if you've read the book, or if you're going to read the book, you'll see there's a white supremacist group in there. And you may be shocked by the language that I use that, is depicted on their flyers and their handbooks. Well, there was a historic group that I actually used as the model, and I used their actual handbills to draw that language out. In today's environment, it's shocking to see somebody openly say these kinds of things. But back then it was fairly common. By the way, that group still operates today. And it's the kind of group where celebrities are often given honorary memberships. And I don't know if the group ever publicly apologized for the things they did. It would be nice if they did. Anyway, let's get back to the executive order. So EO 9066, and it's because I'm a wonk, right? I love talking about this stuff. It was issued on February 19th, 1942, which was really just weeks after Pearl Harbor. So understandable, emotions are running high. Of course, they're fanned by this decades of, discrimination that Asians, Japanese and Chinese are less than human, that they're sneaky, that they're untrustworthy. You see this over and over again in the paraphernalia documentation of the time. Again, that they are more loyal to the country of their birth. I was tweeting and somebody showed me a drawing that Dr. Seuss had done years ago which was against the Chinese, but, was depicting them as being fifth columnists for China and getting payoffs from China, to try to turn against this country. Dr. Seuss. I know that's like not news, but I had sort of forgotten that in the midst of time. Anyway, so the executive order was issued February 19th. The first relocation orders were issued March 24th. And when the orders went out, families were given 1 week to report to the camps. I mean, actually, they were bused or taken in railroad carts to the camps. 1 week, that meant they had to do something with all their property, figure out what's going on. And it was pandemonium. I mean, I know some people at least have heard some of these stories, but, these were family stories that I had heard too. My husband's family, for instance, owned a florist in Berkeley. They had trucks, they had equipment, they had all this stuff. 1 week to get rid of it. In some cases, a neighbor or a friend may have offered to try to hold things for them. But in many, many cases, people either offered them pennies on the dollar, or they just waited until they were carted away because they knew then there was nothing they could do. So a lot of people lost everything, lost whatever property they had, all their furniture, their personal belongings. Some cases where friends or family, took care of things for them. Jamie Ford has a wonderful book on that. Hotel at the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, but that wasn't the rule. That was more the exception. So by June, all Japanese have been removed from the exclusion zone, which is California, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona, and they are in Army custody. During that time, it's not like there weren't legal arguments being made, people trying to sue, trying to be released from the camps. But it wasn't until the end of 1944 that the ACLU brought a case to the Supreme Court. They took a long time because they wanted to make sure they had just the absolute best defendant possible. And I love this case because she was a clerk for the state of California again, and I'm a former Fed, so I'm a wonk. And I just love that they used another a statey in this case to bring the case. But what ended up happening is the Supreme Court handed down a decision based on this case that the U.S. could not hold a citizen who was conceitedly loyal to the U.S. in an internment camp. The woman's name was Mitsui Endo. And like I said, she worked for the state of California. She worked for the Motor Vehicles Department. So it was clear from her example that she was clearly Americanized. She spoke no Japanese. She had never been to Japan. She dressed like an American. She ate like American. She had a brother who had enlisted in the Army. So that Supreme Court decision ended up revoking the executive order. January 2nd, 1945. The last camp did not close until March of 1946. And that's because many Japanese could not return back to their homes because of the continued threat of violence. And as a matter of fact, it kind of sparked a little eastward migration of Japanese. And that's part of the reason why we have more Japanese towards the East Coast than previously, where they were sort of more congregated on the West Coast in California. Like I said, they remained in the camps because they feared violence. There was no place to go for them. In 1983, an apology was issued by the US government and reparations were paid. And they calculated at that point how much money and property was lost by the people who'd been sent to the camps. And in 1983 dollars, that was calculated to $2.7 billion in lost possessions. You can only imagine what that might be today. One last thing I'll just say about all this is some of you may remember after 9/11, for a brief period of time, there was a debate. Should America put people of Arab descent who are in America in internment camps because there was this fear of the threat after 9/11. And that went on for about 3 days, and then it stopped. And I have to say, I was very proud of my country when that happened. And that, if nothing else, we learned from the Japanese internment, right? That experience, I don't want to say made it worthwhile, but, gave it worth, right? So the last thing I'm going to talk about are the fire balloons, and then I'm happy to open it up to questions. People usually have a lot of questions. So I mentioned the incident in the very beginning where there's the explosion on Gearheart Mountain that kills Elsie, the preacher's wife, and the 5 children. True event. The thing that exploded was a fire balloon, also known as a fugo. Now, when I was growing up, because it wasn't that far removed from World War II, I had heard of fire balloons. And I am only sort of surprised to learn today that almost nobody has heard about the fire balloons. Maybe if you lived on the West Coast, you might have heard a little bit, but they were a true thing. They were these giant balloons, about 30 feet in diameter, that the Japanese military made. They were made of rice paper, right? They had very rudimentary incendiary devices hanging beneath them in like a harness. And the idea was they were going to release these balloons and they would drift over the United States. And then the timers would go off and release the incendiary devices and start fires and create panic and, havoc and frighten the American people. Well, why did the Japanese come up with this kind of crazy sounding idea, at least crazy by modern times? Well, it all has to do with Doolittle's raid. So some of you guys may know that after Pearl Harbor, the US was really keen on striking Japan on the mainland. It was sort of a symbolic thing, but they really wanted to do it. So they did devise this raid where bombers actually did a refueling on an aircraft carrier. It was the first time ever at sea, so they could travel a distance all the way to Japan. They did get some bombs off. The ones who survived landed in China. It was a real Hail Mary pass. I suggest if you don't know a lot about it, that you go ahead and read about it. But the fact that they were able to do that really made the Japanese emperor very mad. And he said, I want to strike back on the US mainland. And he, told his War Department to figure out a way to do it. And they had no idea. They launched a number of programs, and this was back in 42. And here it is in 44. For some reason, the fire balloon program is one of the few that's made it to this far. And they decide to go ahead and try it, even though at this point they know the war is lost. And it's really not going to have any outcome. It's, again, another of these symbolic gestures. So they made several thousand of these balloons. The rice paper was made by Japanese schoolgirls at school, just hundreds of them making this paper and then patched together to make these balloons. And they, like I said, floated off several thousand of them. About 285 incidents were noted by the authorities in the United States. Aside from the explosion on Gearheart Mountain, none of them caused any substantial damage at all. A few forest fires, that sort of thing, but very small. Some as high, far away as, Alaska. Of course, some in Hawaii, some were fished out of the Pacific Ocean. I think they one or two got as far as Michigan, but mostly it was in Pacific Northwest and in part of Canada. I'm trying to think if there was one more thing I wanted to say about the balloons. It's really fascinating. You can find a little bit more online. There's a great book on them called Fugo that really gives sort of the whole history. But the only reason that the fire balloons were able to make it to the United States is Japan knew about the jet stream. America, and actually most of the rest of the world, did not know about the jet stream, even though it had been discovered in 1927 by a Japanese researcher. And he is the Japanese researcher who appears in this book. So that's how it all sort of ties together. Okay, that's all I had to say prepared. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, there's so much to talk about. and the parallels to today are really remarkable. I read, I think it was today or maybe yesterday, and I don't remember if it's the Times or the Journal, that some large percentage of Americans believe that immigrants are taking their jobs, and are a huge threat. That feeling has not gone away. We have, we're here in Arizona, close to a border war, down in Tucson, where you recently were. So those emotions are not just wartime emotions. And I think it's part of Putin's rhetoric as well. But with all the migration that has happened in the world with climate change and so forth, there are many nations who citizens are really fearful that welcoming people in of different origin is going to, damage them personally, damage them economically. The thought of intermarriage is horrific. One of the themes in your book, in fact, is that Mako is married to an American, not a Japanese, but it's the Issei, the native-born Japanese, who were more opposed to her being married to an American than the other way around. And I think, I've been to Japan several times, and there's a racial purity strain in the Japanese. It isn't just here. The treatment of the Ainu, for example, Laura Jo Rowland wrote a really great series of books set in Tokugawa, Japan. And one of the things she wrote about, in fact, was the indigenous Japanese, the Ainu, and how they were treated, by the higher caste. And I just finished a book, 2 books, one set in Mexico about the caste system there between the indigenous people and the mixed breed people and the Spanish, the Castilian people. And another one set in India, where the caste system is even more toxic. So I think it's been with us in human history all along.
Well, it certainly has. So a couple things. One is, I will say, while I don't address it too much, it might kind of bubble up a little bit, particularly in Mako's thoughts. But, absolutely, Japanese are not blameless in a lot of things, and they can be kind of racist. I noticed this growing up. My mother was kind of racist, which I always thought was a little weird because we were mixed race, and, people aren't always very self-aware, I think, of of the issues that they carry around with it. But it was something that she had inherited as well. But that was something, the reason it kind of comes through in Mako is because it is something that I observed in my mother and also in my husband's family to a degree. I'm not criticizing them at all, but until my father-in-law's generation, they did not marry outside of their race. There was a lot of pressure for the Japanese of his parents' generation to only marry fellow Japanese. Mm-hmm. And when my father-in-law, his wife, my mother-in-law, is white. I think he was the youngest. So by the time it happened to him, I think they had gotten used to it a little bit. But the first couple of times it happened in the family, I think it was quite a bit more difficult. That's why everyone thinks it's so funny that me, half Japanese, and my husband, half Japanese, actually got married because we're still a match set, if you know what I mean. But the other thing I wanted to bring up, the first thing that you brought up, which is that this, there always seems to be in society this fear of economic competition that, is the basis of this, fear or hatred of the other. That's true, but to what degree, right, is it used? So one of the things that really made me want to write this book is that, as some of you guys know, I'm a former CIA analyst and NSA analyst. I was an intelligence analyst for 30 years. A big chunk of the time I spent as an analyst was looking at basically what were civil wars, right? Civil unrest. And the kinds of situations that end up in a humanitarian catastrophe, oftentimes where you have genocides or mass atrocities, right? So it's the worst type of conflict you can possibly imagine, where people within a country who one day were neighbors and got along, somehow managed to get along, the next day take up arms and they're trying to slaughter each other, right? Well, it doesn't really happen that fast. But when you work these issues, you see the same pattern of behavior over and over again. And it's taking these fears that are natural, right? Oh, my neighbor, regardless of what ethnicity he has, is getting one up on me. He's doing better than me. How do I compete with? And how do we react to them? It's that it becomes weaponized by groups or individuals who want to seize power. And so, just like I tried to show with the whole fact that there was no reason to fear the Japanese of spying or sabotage, not one case was ever found after the war, not one out of 120,000 people sent to camps, right? So in other words, a completely unfounded fear made America put its own citizens in incarceration, right, for years. It's how you handle that fear, right? There's many instances where that fear exists, but people, are kind of, I don't want to say trained, but, society tries to handle it and see it for what it really is. It's those cases where it becomes weaponized, where the fear becomes weaponized. And it's an unreasonable fear, because we have never seen it happen, right? Where an underclass economically comes up and then subjugates the ruling class. No, it doesn't happen like that. It's a fear. So, when you see these behaviors manifesting in your own country, a country that, as I studied Bosnia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, saw these behaviors, never thought I would see it in America, right?
It's because you're not as old as I am, honey, because I lived through McCarthy. No, I'm really serious.
No, you're right.
I remember it vividly. I mean, I was about 10 years old when McCarthy really got going. And, there were 8 years. My father was really upset with me because when I was, I think, a freshman or a sophomore at Stanford, so it was either 58 or 59, we went up to protest against HUAC, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and we were fire hosed down the steps of the courthouse. It was right about the time that the whole McCarthy thing had gone to such an extreme, which is what always happens, that it had gone to such an extreme that people were coming back from it. And I don't remember who it was said the other day. I don't remember if it was Judge Sotomayor or who it was, or maybe it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, after her death, about, the pendulum swings so far and then it will swing back. And I think we're seeing a really terrifying swing at the moment, but it has happened here before. And I wasn't alive in 1920s when Robert La Follette in Wisconsin, another epicenter of all this, did that whole isolationist thing. So, we've had periods of it here.
We have, but don't you, I think mostly we thought we had learned from the McCarthy episode, right?
Well, apparently not.
Apparently not. And that's kind of what I mean. I think it's kind of shocking and eye-opening that, like you said, the pendulum swinging, and it really is swinging to more of an extreme than maybe a lot of us ever thought would happen.
It is. And you raised an excellent point, which is that a lot of the politicians, instead of doing the right thing or even governing, are pandering to their voters. I mean, look at all the crap going on at the moment, is pure pandering. You'd like to think that people actually aren't really like that, but they are so reluctant to give up power or lose power that they are going to pander to the worst of us. I mean, to me, that is the legacy of Trump, is that you can pander to the worst of us, the worst parts of us, and, create some kind of a power base. And it's, I just talked to a really interesting man who wrote a book called The Budapest Dossier about Ceausescu and, what went on in Romania. And, you see that Putin is trying to convince the Russians that, there's a real threat from the Ukraine and comparing them to the Nazis. Why? Because he's an old man and actually visibly an ill man who is trying desperately to hang on to power. Or you have Trump and his lies, about the election. People who get power don't want to give it up, and they do really awful things to hold on to it. But that wasn't really the deal, I think, so much in the internment thing was, I think it was an effort to kind of contain fear. I don't know if I'm explaining it very well.
Well, I
totally
mean,
undeserved. But, it was like, okay, if we round up these people, we have eliminated a threat.
it's a reaction, and politicians in a time when there's, like think of 9/11, right? Where the enemy cuts the legs out from under you and you
Yeah.
appear to be weak or, ill-planned at least. It's an attempt to regain control, to assert authority, and I understand that. But
It doesn't make it right. That's for sure.
it doesn't make it right, especially knowing, I kind of don't want to make it too political. I know that the facts that I'm laying out make it sound like I'm trying to politicize it, but really what I'm trying to show, through that, not so much in the book, it's a little more artful in the book. Like I said, I've worked this now on both sides. I've also worked in policy. So for instance, I was involved in the Iraq war planning in 2002 and 2003. And I know that issues get politicized. And that is an example of where a great emotional thing for this nation was politicized and ended up pulling us down a very bad path, right? And you probably don't want to get into that discussion, but there were a lot of things hidden, and, the American public was deceived in many ways there. I'm not saying that it was done outright 100% in the case of the war, but it was another one of those examples where they knew that this was not justified, but they did not have the political will to stand up at the time. And it was just easier to say, like you're alluding to, it's easier to put them in the camp, right, than to fight it. It makes us look like we're being strong and we're doing the right thing. And, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, because also it's a political class that is not going to fight back. And, that is part of the, really heartbreaking situation. When the Japanese were going into the camps, their leaders were telling them, we have to prove to them that we are good, loyal citizens. And so we're going to do everything that they ask of us. We're not going to fight back. We're going to go to the camps. We're not going to make a fuss. Now, there were some people who were, trying to get out of the camps, lawsuits and that sort of thing. But by and large, this is what they were told, and the model citizen, even then. And part of, I think, one the reason why they were reluctant to talk about it later, because a lot of them were ashamed.
Yeah.
They were ashamed that they took it, even though they knew it was wrong. They knew they were not a threat. They knew they were American citizens. They had rights. They didn't fight it. And later they were ashamed that they, went along with it, that they should have fought as Americans.
There's a tremendous tendency for people. I used to, back in the days when I was actually involved in law, there used to be, I could see that women would come in a divorce situation, and they felt that somehow, if they just were really good, that the divorce either wouldn't happen or that the terms would be kinder. And I remember I would say to them, no, that's not the way this is going to go. You need to stand up and fight. This is your one chance, to look after yourself, look after your children, whatever. It's not being a good wife, a good mother here. It's not the path to be taking. And I think that, people often react that way when the reality of dissolution and cruelty is so, they think somehow if they just behave better, that it will go away, but it doesn't.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to raise. I think you're right, especially with women, maybe more before than now. We were told that the ideal was to be submissive and quiet. And if you were good enough, right, other people would sort of.
Well, listen, my husband's family is Jewish, and, there's all kinds of family who, in Austria and Germany, they were citizens, they were contributors to the economy, the whole bit. They absolutely could not believe that, what was about to happen to them was going to happen to them. Many of them could have escaped earlier and chose to stay because they thought, it just would never happen. And I think that's not an uncommon reaction to. I've been proud of the Ukrainians. There was a woman, I don't know if you saw her photo. She's a World War II sharpshooter. I think she's 98 years old, and she fought for Russia. And there's a photo of her standing up there in her uniform. Well, all of her, she's like solid metals from neck, down here. And she got a call from Russia saying, join us and whatever it is. And she refused. She said, no, I'm a Ukrainian and this is not right. And, I'm going to stand up against what you're doing. And I thought, wow, good for her.
That is amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
like I said, in the 90s, I worked a lot of genocides and stuff, and they never believe it's coming. I mean, even
That's
when they
right.
know at a certain
You think
level.
you're protected by the laws. You think you're protected by, your contributions to society. You just can't believe that scaffolding that has made your life possible is going to collapse on you. And so there is a tendency to behave as though if you're just good enough, it won't happen. You made a really interesting point, I thought, in the book, that the camps were in really isolated places. They had almost no amenities. They were jerry-rigged, crap construction. No, it's a wonder they all didn't have cholera and whatever.
Right.
Because, sort of like out of sight, out of mind, we're going to do this. But if they're visible, then maybe there will be more protest.
Right.
And you also point out that the guards initially were kinder to them, and then, it hardens up.
Right.
There's a whole dynamic there that is certainly, I think, over time has happened, forever.
It's almost unbelievable, really. The camps. I mean, I remember hearing the descriptions from my father-in-law and other family members, and you can almost, it's hard to believe, especially in America, that you would treat people like this, right? The camps, when they went out there, in many cases, it was just these, shells of barracks with, nothing, just cracks in the walls. The wind and the sand would come through. And I don't know if people saw the show, The Terror, the second season, I guess it was. They did a story that was based on the internment as well. And it showed how in the beginning, especially from the San Francisco area, they were brought to a racetrack. And that was sort of the staging area where they were kept for a few weeks before they were brought out into the deserts. And they were literally brought to horse stables. Like the stalls hadn't even been cleaned out. So they were told they were going to be living in a horse stall full of manure and straw. And I think when you're subjected to something like that, you're just in such shock that you can be so dehumanized so quickly. And it makes you ashamed, right? Mm-hmm. How is it that I can be treated like this, that I can be so devalued? Is there a kernel of truth to it? Even though logically that there isn't. And
I'm sure it shatters your sense of self-worth.
Yeah.
I've led really a privileged life, and it's been borne in on me recently more and more, just how lucky I have been. I read somewhere that said that if you were born and lived in America in the second half of the 20th century, i.e. after the war, that's the best it's probably ever been for anybody. And now we're seeing it all, begin to disintegrate, which maybe means that nothing is forever. But before we get Patrick there's one thing we haven't really talked about, which is sort of the horror part of this book here, is you mentioned the ghost, but what about the spiders? I mean, I think the spiders are wonderful, and there are horror tropes in the novel. This is not really a political novel, even though our discussion may have made you think that it is. It really isn't. It's squarely in there in Dean Koontz and Stephen King territory, and I think we should mention that.
Well, I thought that the Japanese, it's something that I'm interested in, but afraid of at the same time, because Japanese folklore, about the whole underworld and everything is immense. And you practically need a PhD to really speak of it intelligently. And, like a lot of people of a particular ethnicity, whatever, it was just sort of there growing up, right? So I never really studied it, but there were always Japanese, fairy tale books and folk tale books, or we'd watch shows, that sort of thing. And so I just had a sense of the whole panoply. But literally in Japan, and it's so different from what a lot of us know in the West, right? Like what our folk tale traditions might be. But in Japan, there's like a ghost or a demon for like every crossroad, every temple, every hill, practically every tree. they're all over the place, and it's just like a part of your life. It's not, do you believe or not believe? So that's kind of how I wanted it to seem for Mako and Aiko. And they're the ones who have the most interaction, with the spirit world. The demon is a Juragumo, which is really interesting. It's a woman who appears carrying a baby. She appears to male travelers, and she begs the male travelers to help her. Will you hold my baby? And the ones who do are rewarded by her turning into a giant spider and devouring them. So, there was some discussion over, oh my God, like, here are these guys just trying to help her out, and, and they're punished for it. But as somebody pointed out in one discussion, the guys who help you when you say, hold my baby, usually have a little ulterior motive, right? So maybe they deserved getting devoured after all. But, there's a little bit of that in the book too, how the men, especially the guards, respond to the women in the camp, right? But yeah, so I did try to weave a little bit of the Japanese folklore in there, just because it's so dang fascinating.
It is fascinating. I mean, if you travel there, you certainly are aware of demons. And, it reminds me, interestingly enough, of the ancient Greeks, where every stream and every tree and everything had its own nymph or dryad or goddess. And I think, in old societies that were really close to nature, and Japan is a very, very old society, that's what they did. They imbued the natural world with spirits and sometimes demons to explain bad things. And I think they're more alive still in Japan than in other countries. When you travel there, you really get a sense of that. It's a fascinating country to visit. But yet, I can remember the first time I went to Germany in the 1980s with my husband, how uncomfortable I was remembering the war, because, I was born in 1940, so I can remember vaguely some of the war. And strangely enough, I didn't really feel that way going to Japan, but I can remember that my father absolutely refused to buy anything manufactured in Japan. He just, a hangover from, the war. And also, Alma, there was a time when made in Japan was synonymous for cheap, long before it went to like China and Vietnam. And I'm not even sure where that came from. But I think, anytime you've had a horrible conflict like that, it's hard for a lot of people to move past it. That especially those who might have fought in it, lost people they cared about in it, suffered economic damage in it.
I understand that. It's just, hopefully, maybe with a little distance of time, they sort of look at the big picture, though, so that they can put those feelings in perspective. Because being, resentful of the war, being resentful because you lost, family members or any things like that, that's understandable. But it's really very separate from the internment.
I agree with you entirely. And, it does take sort of a generation, to move past the hard feelings of any conflict. And I remember sailing around the Baltic, and honest to God, every country you went to, it was like a globe revolved or something, because if you were in Sweden, the enemy was here, and then you went to Finland, the enemy was Sweden, and then it was Russia. And if you went to Russia, it was then, the Baltic can just give you this huge headache, because of the constant shifting and that's true in the Middle East and other parts of the world.
It's true in East Asia too. They all hate Japan over there. So it's, oh gosh, then there's always going to be a certain level of hate. But I think if you at least embrace the truth, it makes it easier. It's just,
I think the core of what is outrageous, the real core of it is that these were American citizens whose rights we abrogated. And, there's absolutely no justification for that.
And it was enabled.
I don't think there's enough outrage. Yeah. I agree entirely. Patrick, come and join us and see whether you have comments that you would like to make.
Hey, I'm here. Let's see. Yeah, there are some comments from the audience. Let's see here. Yeah, Sally would like to know. She asks, since this is your most personal book, did you feel a different spectrum of emotions while writing it?
Absolutely. For one thing, this is the first time where I've written a major character who is Asian. And this may sound really naive and crazy, but when I set out to do it, I really didn't think any big deal, right? Because as authors, you have to get into all your characters' heads, right? And it could be old, young, male, whatever. That's just part of the challenge and part of the fun. But I was really amazed at the feelings that came bubbling up. Like I had suppressed a lot of anger over the years for certain things, how I might have been treated because I was Asian, because I was a minority at work. There are just things that you don't allow yourself to really think about or deal with. You know, you press them down and you just keep motoring along. And yet they all came up, and it really made me realize that, you know, we all carry some anger in us that's justified, right? And it feels really good when you deal with that justified anger. There's a lot of heads getting knocked in this book. And I had a lot of fun writing it.
Was there any of that? I mean, not to have you talk dirty about the CIA. That's probably dangerous. But is there any institutional stuff going on within that organization that you experienced?
You know, I have to say CIA was much better than NSA. I was at NSA also. That's a DoD organization. So probably not too surprising to find out that it's a lot more, you know, misogynistic and not as great. Well, the really interesting thing about NSA is it's most like a tech company. I was writing an article once for a client on innovation and what Silicon Valley gets wrong as innovators. And because I had read this really interesting article on it, and they talked about, like, you know, the racism and the sexism and the ageism in Silicon Valley. And as I'm writing this up, I'm like, holy crap, this is NSA. This is NSA, except their ageism goes the other way. They didn't really like young people, but but they really don't like women, and they really don't like minorities, and they won't admit it, but they have a huge problem. And yeah, so that's probably what I resented more than at CIA. I'm sure it was there at CIA. If you ask some of my colleagues who were also minorities, I had my own problems because I was a mid-careerist. They don't like mid-careerists either, but meaning I was already kind of advanced in my career by the time I came in. I didn't come up through their ranks, and they hated that. So I was dealing with that. Maybe I didn't notice the other stuff so much, but yeah, there was quite a bit of issues like that. Now, I've talked to folks in private industry, and they assure me, you know, like who work in the defense industry, and they assure me that it's much better at the agencies than it is in private industry. So I think we're all screwed.
Let's see here. Okay, let's see. Tarini, I think is how I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, but they ask, given how the story renders horror as something derived from people themselves, was there a specific character you found most difficult to write?
Well, I really didn't like Elsie, the preacher's wife. Yes, because that's just something I don't understand. I have to say, I'm not a deeply religious person, even though I went to Catholic school when I was growing up. Maybe because I went to Catholic school when I was growing up, you know, I've seen what folks who are very, very close to religion, maybe to the point of being illogical, what that can be like. And I just really, especially as I've aged, and, you know, I'm kind of a scientist now, I just have a hard time understanding people who are all about faith and not about fact at all. So yeah, she was a really difficult one. Plus, she kind of represents the worst in some people. So
let's see. Yes, Lynn asks, are you familiar with the one-man play, Hold These Truths, the story of Gordon Hirabayashi, I think that's right, Hirabayashi, which deals with this subject in Seattle before and during the internment?
No, but thank you very much for the information. I'm going to go check it out.
Yeah, there is quite a body of literature, emerging, a lot of nonfiction, memoirs and things, but also, one that comes to mind is Naomi Hirahara's recent book,
Clark and Division. Yeah.
Yes,
Clark
that's
and
excellent.
Division. Yeah.
And I grew up in Chicago and was amazed by what I read.
Oh,
I
Really?
mean, that's not, I mean, I was out there living in the white suburb on, on the lake. And it was a real surprise to me to read Naomi's book and see. Of course, I was so little then. I mean, I was
Sure.
I was a toddler. So there wasn't probably any reason I would have been aware of it. But
Right.
but it must have been fascinating to read the book afterwards and see this other world that existed.
yeah, it really was.
I have a good friend who's Pima out here, and the Gila River camp was very close to Sakatone, big Pima Indian
Right.
community, and he talks about how his mom and his grandmother, there was a little bit of friendship that developed between those two cultures, so close to each other. Very
wow.
interesting.
But yet I can tell you, because I first came to Arizona in 1950, that one of the most cherished places and that where tourists were always directed and which people truly love were the Japanese flower gardens here.
Oh yeah.
And they were finally done away with by creeping development. It was just, like the Arabian horse ranches in Scottsdale are falling, left and right to the desire to build condos and, real estate taxes. But the Japanese flower gardens here were an absolutely beloved institution from the
They were
first
still
time
there.
I came out here for forever.
Yeah, until the early 2000s, they were still here along
they were.
Baseline and
And there's downtown, there's a wonderful Japanese center. They have a garden and they do all kinds of things. So, it's I guess every place is something of a mix.
Yes. And I wasn't sure how many of the camps, had museums or some kind of memorial there, but the Heart Mountain folks tweeted me today with the list. So I'm going to try to put that up on the website because a few of the camps I think have been kind of allowed to be reclaimed, right, by the prairies and such, but some of them are still maintained. So
I know that I remember hearing that Del Webb was the one who developed the Arizona camps, Poston and Gila. I don't think they put that in their current leaflets, about Del Webb, but I think he, if I remember correctly, someone might know the answer to that.
huh.
Yeah. Getting back to some of these questions. Let's see here. Let's see, I'm sorry, I got derailed. Yeah, well, there are some obvious questions about what are you working on now? Do you have ideas for more thrillers? And what do you have cooking at the moment?
Boy, well, the second spy novel, for those of you who may not know, I wrote a spy novel last year, Red Widow, and yay!
It was a very good book.
Thank you so much. There's a second book in the works. It's called Red London, and we just finalized the manuscript on that. I don't have a pub date. I know it's going to be in 2023, and I'm sure it'll be in the spring, like they usually are. So that's the next one. And I'm trying to think of an idea for the next historical horror. It's hard. It's really hard to find the right mix of event and circumstance that will lend itself to something like this. I am open to ideas. So if anybody wants to email me with ideas,
Have you read the novels of Dan Simmons? Is he an inspiration to you at all? Do you know his stuff?
I did read The Terror, and I started reading one of his more science fiction-y books. The Terror was a wonderful book. I mean, really, so well done.
He's a terrific writer. I wish that his health had been better longer and he would have written more.
Did he pass away?
I don't think so, but I think he's just, I'm not honestly sure, but he was ill for quite a while. He came to see us several times and I absolutely loved him. He wrote some crime novels along with, he was a multi-genre author, very, very versatile, but always wonderful voice, very literate. You know, that's an interesting thought, Alma, about what is it? Because you have to really do a deep dive into the historical background. It takes a lot of your life, a lot of energy, to familiarize yourself well enough with something like that before you can write it.
Yeah, and it's hard to say in advance almost really what's that combination of fact and speculation that's going to make something work well. I've solicited ideas from people, or I just like look at what are the top natural disasters, historic natural disasters, right? But the things that leap to mind, like a lot of people bring up the Hindenburg. Well, it doesn't quite have, while it's a well-known historical event, it actually was pretty small. It didn't really change the course of, they still flew dirigibles for years afterwards.
And it was a real accident. It wasn't malevolent.
Right. Although we can always create malevolence.
Well,
yeah. So yeah, I'm sort of fishing around for some ideas. So
I'll keep it in mind. Send you a little stream of
ideas. Thank you. Everyone has their favorite disaster, right? So
oh man, I know Dan Simmons, one of his books was called The Black Hills. And it was really interesting, kind of blending the prophecy of Black Elk as a little boy, and then like a multi-generational story. But I seem to remember that it did involve kind of an ingenious webbing of speculative fiction along with that story. And how you managed to bring the Donner Party story. Just genius. That was really, really special.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. It is a weird thing. I've been asked a bit about that. Like, how can you take so many, different kind of disparate things and weave them all together? And, did my work as an intelligence analyst have anything to do with it? And I really, after some reflection, I think it is, because to do intelligence work, you're sifting through literally thousands of little bits of information, sometimes in a day, and you're looking for the patterns and without creating something out of whole cloth, you're looking for the connectivity. And I think that just like predisposes me to do this in stories. So hopefully, as long as people enjoy it, I'll get the opportunity to keep writing them.
It's actually like quantum computing, as I understand it. So, you have that kind of a brain. You're just a human version of the quantum computer. But I think you're right. It does train your brain to work in certain ways. And, to assemble lots of different information, and some stuff sticks, or you can see patterns that other people miss. And
Barbara, that might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said about me.
Oh, it's scary. Maybe we're going to give you a fake name, oh dear. But no, seriously, I wish I could remember. I just read a fabulous discussion in a thriller about what quantum computing is. And it was such a brilliant explanation that now I can apply it, to what we're talking about. Let me see if I can remember it, and I'll direct you towards it, because you might find it interesting.
That'd be great.
I certainly did. And I'm an idiot about tech. So, if this could work for me, I think it would be very clear.
I actually wrote a primer on quantum for dummies for a certain agency's management, because they have to start understanding what quantum is. But it's so complicated that if you asked me to explain it right now, I couldn't. I'd have to go back, right, and refresh my memory. The explanation is, if you think you understand quantum computing, you don't understand quantum computing.
Yeah. Well, my mind works sort of like that, not to the degree that yours does, but it was kind of comforting to read it and recognize that my brain pattern is not entirely weird, but so it goes. Remember, Patrick, you once asked me, I wrote something sometime long time ago, and I can't remember what it was, but it was a piece to be published. And Patrick came up to me and he said, how'd you have time to look all that up? And I remember looking at him and saying, I didn't look any of it up, Patrick. I already knew it.
Oh, wow.
It was all just there,
Yeah.
It's just accessing the files, right?
Yeah, no, and I am a firm believer, that when you're as old as I am, and your recall begins to slow, it isn't that I've forgotten it. It's just the retrieval system is so now incredibly clogged with, all of it. It's just, I mean, it really is this, that's all it is the retrieval system is taking longer to whirl its way through everything. Because if I'd really forgotten it, I would never, hours later or minutes later, remember it. Or fortunately, I have Patrick who pops up on the chat feature constantly to help me out. But truly, don't you, I think that that's a really great way to look at it, is that, the older you get, the more stuff you acquire, the harder it is for your brain to behave like a computer and
You need
sift
a
through
couple
it.
of external hard drives, Barbara.
That's right. No
Load
kidding.
up.
If I could just do that,
Better indexing system. Although that's the stupidest little things that I can't remember. It just drives me crazy.
I know.
One thing I wanted to
this-
ask you, Alma, before we wrap it up is you mentioned in passing a little comment about how some of the people, once they got out of the camps, often they didn't have a home to go back to. And yeah, I mean, to add insult to injury, there, as I understand it anyway, especially in California, a lot of their property was just seized from them,
Right.
and so bought and sold. And
It's like what happened to the Jews in Europe, I mean, the French were particularly vicious. Cara Black's book, Murder in the Marais, if you read that, that's about what happened, that actually people turned in the Jews in their neighborhood so they could grab their stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
I was doing some research on the Nazis. I can't tell you why, but yeah, there was, I hope I get this right, because here's the memory thing, right? It's not going to pop right back up in place. But who was it? I can't remember. Oh, after the war, when the Allies were going into Germany, they were surprised, a lot of the men were surprised at how well off the Germans were, right? Like across the country, because in America and the UK especially, right, there'd been so much hardship enduring for the war, right? Rationing and all this stuff. They get into Germany and they find that the average, even though they lost the war, that their standard of living was pretty high. And that's because of so much they had seized from the people they sent to the camps.
That's right. And it's still going on, trying to sort out whether it's art or, property or whatever it is. There's an ongoing, stream still of trying to sort it all out. So it would have been truly desperate to come out of the camp with absolutely no resources. And many of them either too old or too broken to try to start life again. It's really tragic.
Yeah. My husband's family were lucky in that it was a big family. The family members were still relatively young. The older sisters, I think several of them got married in the camps. One of those husbands ended up going out and working for the government at a certain point, and then they sponsored family members and were bringing them out sort of one at a time. And then my father-in-law ended up joining the army. He fought in the European theater. But yeah, the stories they tell.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Alma. This has been really fascinating. Thank you for joining us and rallying enough to have a conversation, even if you're not feeling totally robust. So thank you all for joining us tonight and participating one way or another. And let me remind you that our copies of the Fervor are somewhere between the publisher and Alma at the moment. And they'll be turning around and coming towards Scottsdale very shortly. So fascinating book and very thought-provoking and terrifyingly modern. Even if it's an historical, you will find astonishing.
Fervor is such a wonderful word too.
Isn't
It's such a great word.
Oh, the fervor?
Fervor, yeah. Love it.
Yeah, it's used in a very interesting way that I would not have normally thought of. So I think the title is great. Anyway, thanks very much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night.
Hope to see you out here again soon.
We do, Alma.
Sure.
Maybe in the spring with your next spy